That's the only thing I had to do. Now, Galatians chapter 4. So, welcome to church. Welcome if you're new. I don't know if you've come before or you're new to our church, but it's a good day if you haven't normally come, because you hear a very important message from a very important, not me, but the most prolific writer in the New Testament. So it's a very significant theme that he wants to get across. Now, it's written to, it says Galatians, so it's a set of churches in Galatia that Paul had a hand in starting. But there's another group that have come in and they've got a contrary message to what he did and he had to say, and Paul is very concerned about it because he says it's harmful, it's very destructive to their lives. And maybe the easiest way on the screen to note the difference between their teachings, the three top points of the false teachers' teachings, Paul says, is 1, believe in Jesus, 2, obey the law, and they say because of that, the result is salvation. That will be the 3 points of the false teachers' thing. In contrast, Paul's approach is, number 1, believe in Jesus, number 2, you'll be saved, and then as a result, obedience to the law. It's a very different thing, and Paul says this is, he describes this as slavery, and this is freedom. And I want you to notice what they choose, each of them in contrast, to put together. So the false teachers put belief in Jesus, belief and obedience, they think they go together and the result's salvation. But Paul says no, belief and salvation go together and the result's a changed life. The result's obedience. So it's important to see this is the most important message for Paul in pretty much all his letters, and it's on the basis of the resurrection of Jesus. Just a quick thought about that, if you've never reflected on that, just to contrast with the person we call the Buddha, Gautama Siddhartha, the prince. When he died, his followers were generally with him, grieving about that, and then they organised themselves later to pull together his writings, his wisdom for the world. But when Jesus was executed, no one was with him. All his friends abandoned him, right? They were gone for all money because they thought they were next. But after him rising from the dead and commissioning them to go change the world, 40 days later, they've got something to say. And the central thing is he's risen again. You should follow him like we do. And so the only reason people had something to write about Jesus historically was that actually he did rise from the dead. So it's important to notice that. It's very significant. So in other words, Paul's saying it's for anyone who would believe, who would follow. This is so anyone can be adopted and welcomed into the family of God. Paul's saying it's got nothing to do with anything you're good or bad at. It's got everything to do with the gift of God without any reference to human standards. And this message of Paul is on a collision course with these people in the first century in particular that are saying you need to follow Jewish customs. In particular, food, foreskins and festivals. If you have a look on the next slide, these are the 3 things they bring up. The first one is food. It's interesting. So Jewish people, they separate from eating with others who aren't Jewish and they have different food. And so it's interesting that this verse refers to one of the lead disciples, Peter. It says, before certain men came from James, Peter was eating with Gentiles. But when they came, even he drew back and separated himself, you see. So this is dividing their church family. The second one is foreskins. Apologise if you didn't expect that to be said at church today, but I'm just a messenger. But see, it's a big thing. See, Paul said it doesn't matter about your background. Its invitation is to all who believe. But these people say, no, it does matter. And if you're not Jewish, you've got to become like Jews. If you're a man, you've got to get circumcised. He's saying if you're a Christian, that is just means being a Christian means nothing to you. And the third one is festivals. They were saying you need to. Paul's getting frustrated with them in that statement there that what are they doing? They're throwing away their life, their freedom. And so the result of the collision of these 2 messages is the letter of Galatians. That's the result. So in chapter 1, Paul tells his own story to try and debunk the issue. Chapter 2, he tells how a person can be made right with God. In chapter 3, he retells the story of Israel and how Jesus is the highlight. And then in chapter 4, he compares these 2 ideas of slavery and freedom. And we're in the heart of that section where he draws on a very important story in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. And he makes a contrast between 2 people initially. If you heard the saying, there's 2 types of people in the world. Anyone heard that saying? Okay, see if you can find yourself here, okay? So there's 2 types of people in the world. Which one are you? Or who do you sleep next to or in your family? I used to be the other side. I'm this side now. Because I think, I can't miss that meeting. I can't miss that thing. I can't be late for that. So, I have a million alarms. My wife has one and then sleeps through it and I have to wake up. It can be frustrating if you're married to, or living with people like this. The next one, yeah. Say no more, Eat the whole thing or leave the crust. The next one is interesting. This helps you work out who's who in the zoo. In our family, you can see I'll be on, over that side. No. My daughter and I are here. My son and my wife are there. The next one, type A is James Grady. Type B is Martin Kennedy. And then the next one, those books. Don't turn the corners. The next one I think is Unforgivable. Right? Don't understand that one. Anyway, the point of those is Paul's doing his own, there's two types of people in the world thing there. And he's making a very important contrast between Ishmael and Isaac. He's going to highlight the contrast in different ways for us to get the essence of what God is inviting us into. But you've got to understand some of this basic story from Genesis. So in Genesis 12, God comes to this man Abraham and says, I'm going to bless you so you can bless the whole world. You're actually going to have so many descendants, they outnumber the stars, you're going to fill the earth. And Abraham's like, wow, that's amazing. The only problem is I'm really old, my wife's really old. She can't have kids anymore. And so after a while, they conclude as a couple, we need to take this problem into our own hands. The only way God's going to give us all those descendants is if we start now. So she says, all right, you got to have a kid with my slave girl Hagar. And so they do that. And then God comes to them and says, no, this is not how this promise is going to happen. This is not how you're going to have descendants that fill the earth. It's going to come through Sarah. And in due time, God honors his promise and gives them a child, Isaac. And so we're in a conversation about the children of Abraham. Now, this is a hot topic in their day because if you were Jewish, you wanted to be in and you cared about who was in and out. And this was often an argument in the Gospels. Who's children of Abraham? We're children of Abraham. You're not. You are, that sort of thing. And so Paul's like, well, okay, let's talk about the children of Abraham. We have two of them, Ishmael and Isaac. And these two actually become the antecedents for two people groups, the Jews and the Muslims, don't they? So this is a very important story in the development of world history. And Paul is trying to look at this contrast in a particular way to highlight how God brings life with him, and also in this actual story from Genesis, you see two different ways people relate to God. So let's look at verse 21, and we're going to see the contrast of these two guys. Verse 21, 22 say, tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? For it's written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman, that's the guy on the left side, Ishmael, and one by the free woman. It's very important to see the difference. So he's making a very interesting parallel. There's two sons, there's two women. One was a slave, one woman was free. And this primarily affects how these kids are going to be conceived. So Hagar, she's on this side, she's younger. She can have kids the natural way. So she conceives Hagar, you would say, by natural means. Her and Abraham have sex and they have a child. And he describes that in this section, in the next verse, as in the flesh. Look at verse 23. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh. That's his way of describing it, by natural means. But his son by the free woman over this side was the result of a divine promise. That's how Isaac came into the world, because there was no chance Sarah could make that happen. Only God could make Isaac. He's a miracle baby. And that came on the basis of the promise of God. So there's a big contrast here between human striving and effort and God's action and promise. But notice these two guys are more than just these two guys now. They actually represent two ways of coming into the world, one by natural means, one by supernatural means, right? There's a big difference here. Now, let's notice Paul is saying, again, it's bigger than two guys, bigger than two families, it's actually pointing to a biblical pattern we see in lots of different places. So look, read verse 24. These things are being taken figuratively. The women represent two covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. She's on this side. Now, Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem because she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she's our mother. This is a huge contrast here. It's huge how it represents two ways of relating to God. See, notice the Sinai covenant. How do you get into the Sinai covenant? Does anyone know how you become a part of it? Mum and dad had to be Jewish. That's all. You're born into the thing, right? But how do you get into the new covenant? Mum and dad can't wing that one for you. You've got to choose to trust the promise of the gospel, the offer of salvation through Jesus. So very different, right? One by human means, if you like. One you're born in. One is actually on the basis of the promise. And so these two things highlight, so interesting what they highlight. Paul's about to say three huge things they highlight. One, a contrast between the law on this side and he just said the promise. So one's a child connected to representing the idea of the law. See, at Sinai, what did Moses do? You know, Charlton Heston, Ten Commandments. He gave the commandments as the establishing of a nation. But this side, we're talking about a promise. Everything's based on promise. On this side, he said something astonishing for a Jewish man. This side represents present-day Jerusalem. This side represents the new Jerusalem, where one day there'll be people from every tribe and nation. And the next statement he says is astonishing for a Jewish man to say. This is slavery, and this is freedom. What would it take for a Hebrew of Hebrews to say this is slavery? It's huge that Paul says this, and this is freedom. And actually, this is why ethnic diversity is not a minor issue when it comes to the gospel, because it's a witness to the fact that this is not a thing of the flesh. So God brings together all types of people, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of status, regardless of background, all those things, regardless of your own personal choices in history. God brings all sorts of people together because it's a thing that's divine. It's not a thing of the flesh. And then Paul turns his attention to the fertile and the infertile, to these two women. Let's read verse 27. This is a quote from Isaiah 54. It says, "Be glad, barren woman, for you who never bore a child. Shout for joy and cry aloud, you who were never in labor. Because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband." This is amazing what he's quoting here, because Isaiah is pointing to this amazing thing. The way God is in the world and in God's kingdom is that he seems to bring life to people who can't bear children. And this is a thing that's all around the Bible. And even if you don't know Bible stories, just hear the names of some well-known women. We have this woman, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Hannah, Mary, the mother of Jesus. The story comes to a stop point, and then God needs to act for something to happen. It's a normal pattern in the scriptures. And this thing of fertile, infertile is contrasting again human striving over God's work. And here's something important to say here. He's not dissing women who can have kids. Every child is a gift of God, right? It says that all over the scriptures. He's using the reality of this family story as a way to highlight the way God works as opposed to the way we often work. And his main teaching point of this whole letter is you're justified by faith in what God's done, not your own effort. And so this is one of the ways he's getting at that. But he's not putting down women who've had children. That's a misunderstanding of what he's trying to do here. The thing of having kids naturally is a good thing. But Abraham was given a promise that God's going to give this child. And so, again, this is highlighting a child has come through natural means, but on this side, Isaac represents the child that's come through supernatural means. The contrast is unique each time. And maybe we could just stop and notice this on a human level. So whether it's because, for any woman, because of singleness or infertility, or maybe even both, that they can't have children, what that promise from Isaiah is saying, there is an inheritance that is better than natural children. You might say, oh, Martin, that's easy for you to say. You've had 2 kids of your own, right? And you'd be right. It is easier for me to say, but it's not easy for Paul. He can't have kids. By the way, his wife, if he had one, died. We don't even know if he had one. But Paul is a man who did not even really, couldn't say he had a home. He's regularly beaten. He lost his career. He's a hunted man, and he dies in exile. And he's the one, if you go back to verse 19, this is the hinge of the passage for me. He says, my dear children. And then he applies that promise to himself, recognizing that he says the last line in that promise, more will be your children. So whether you've had your own children or not, if you choose actually to do it all your own, it's different. Whether you had children or not, you choose to put yourself in God's hands. He says, more will be your children. God is going to bring life through your life in ways you can't even work out yet. He's saying here in verse 19 and 20, I'm in pain for you. I'm in the pains of childbirth. You're my kids. I'm in pain so that God might mature you. He's seeing himself as an infertile mother with all these miracle babies. It's a huge thing. And then he contrasts, actually, by the way, I think what's obvious about Paul, which you should take into account in your own life, new birth through God gives him more joy than natural birth. It's very clear in Paul's writings. Verse 28 and 29, he makes another contrast. 28 and 29, now you brothers and sisters like Isaac are children of promise. At that time, the son born according to the flesh persecuted the son by the power of the Spirit. It is the same now. So he's applying this to their actual context. So he's saying that the son born of the flesh is persecuting the son born of the Spirit. And he's saying that's happening in your church. The people, if you like, that represent this way of life, doing it their own way, they're actually creating all these rules, disturbing the freedom of the people of the Spirit. You need to do this and this and this with food and foreskins and festivals. You need to follow this stuff. And he's saying when people become part of a church community together, and some have got in there by their own effort and striving, and some have got in there but by the miracle of God changing their life, the people of the flesh are always going to eventually make trouble for the people of the Spirit. And he's saying here, don't give voice to that. It's really important. It's actually what happens in the original story in Genesis. Ishmael persecutes Isaac. And so you end up with, in the next slide, mate, the circumcisers are persecuting, making trouble for the Galatians, and probably the deepest contrast of the scriptures, the work produced by the Torah is actually in contrast with grace of God, the undeserved favour of God. So there's the basis of what Paul's saying here. But what I want to do now is just give you 3 important applications from this. And the first one is going off the back of verse 30 of Paul's big ending to his passage, his punchline. My thing is, watch out for the extra justifications. Watch out for the extra justifications. Look at verse 30. Paul says, but what does Scripture say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. So I don't know if you're exposed to, like, if you think of it for us today, of teaching that says you need to do this, this, and this. If you want to express real love for God, it's not just about faith. You've got to do these other things to be genuine in that. Well, Paul would have a problem with that. He's saying, don't give those voices the mic in your church. In fact, he gets pretty extreme here. You've got to not allow that to have sway in your life. Because if you're on the hinge of going, yes, I'm beginning to accept that way of life where I'm going to add all these rules to what it means to know Christ, he's saying, don't let that be. He's saying, act very decisively about it. Paul nails it in Galatians about the gospel. Martin Luther nailed it at Wittenberg. You're justified by faith, not by works, not by human striving, by faith in what Jesus has done. But here's the thing, even though you're justified by faith, you might all know that stuff. There's something in the human spirit that says, I want to be on the in any group. And so this could be true in our church. Watch out for the extra justifications. One of them could be spiritual experience. It could be, listen, you need to hear words of knowledge from God, experience prophecy from God. Maybe you need to experience the joy of healing other people. Maybe it's about speaking in tongues. By the way, all wonderful things to do. All good things. Paul encourages. But if those things are how you on the in the church, that's justification by spiritual experience. Watch out for that. It could be with finances. You see a lot of guys like this on the internet saying, listen, if you give God this sort of money, he's going to pay you back tenfold. You don't tithe? Oh, you're a second-class Christian. Well, that's justification by finance. It could be justification by being involved in a certain ministry. If you're not a part of our food distribution on Tuesday, you're not a real Christian. Well, that'd be justification by mercy ministry. You just pick your thing, right? Now, we'll never teach here, or I won't ever teach, that marriage is the hope of your life. It's one of the hardest decisions you can ever make. The Bible doesn't say everyone's got a white picket fence, 2.5 kids and a dog. That's not God's promise to you. It's Jesus. He gives you hope because death doesn't get the last word. But you can be in a church, and maybe if you go and talk to some of our single people, some of them may feel like to be on the in here, you actually need to be married. Now, I think that would be a problem because that would be maybe pointing to justification by marriage. Then you can just add them up. I reckon one that we might be more susceptible to as a church that likes preaching could be justification by knowledge of theology. See, if you came here and you got this is the first time you've heard the word Galatians, you are not on the out because of that. But you may feel that in different ways. You may feel that because of the way things happen here. And I want to say that would be a problem because that's justification by knowledge, not faith. So the first thing, watch out for the extra justifications. That's the first application. The second one is a question for you. Where do you take your hunger? Where do you take your hunger? Because this is what leads to all the justifications. Maybe just think of the backstory. God creates all this goodness in Eden. And it's not just in Eden, it's the garden, a particular place in Eden, right? The Garden of Eden, which shows us it's like God set a table. How hospitable is God? And then the serpent's lies come and shatter that goodness. And then there's a tragic separation. And the headlines in the Bible from them are things like shame, deceit, blame-shifting, alienation, murder, rape, adultery, genocide, betrayal, heartache. And that continues for over 1,000 chapters till Jesus in Revelation ultimately makes his home among us. And so none of us are immune from the everyday ache of living in a world that's both beautiful and broken. So my question is, what do you do with that hunger? What do you do with the fact that life invites you to reckon with the heartache you've avoided and the deep disconnection between you and God, you and others, and you and yourself? What do you do with that hunger for that? See what does Adam and Eve do? They tell themselves a story that God's going to come and smash us. Their nakedness and shame lead them to hide and buffer up with contempt for everyone. But yet God comes looking for them saying, where are you? Who told you that? And did you eat the fruit? Where did you take your hunger, in other words? Think about it in our story in Genesis. Think about it with Abraham and Sarah. Think about the shame for Sarah. By the way, shame by itself isn't an issue. It's part of the created order in Genesis 2. The issue is their response to shame. It's dangerous when you have shameless leaders. They're harmful. Jeremiah said, these people have no shame, so they don't care what they do. That's not good. The issue isn't shame, but actually our response to shame. What's Sarah's response? See, she can't have a kid. So now she's a marked woman in her place. She's ashamed. Like Tamar, how do I carry my shame? She says, you need to have a kid with my slave girl. That's how I get rid of my shame. See? So my question is, what do you do with your hunger? Where do you take your hunger? Because what you do with your nakedness and shame when you feel exposed is often going to be the next set of justifications. It might be, okay, my shame and hunger, I'm going to work hard. I'm going to make lots of dough. I'm going to get a PhD. I'm going to have the best kids, the best family. I'm going to, just name it. And those things they enslave you. Those things become destructive. What would it look like to begin to trust what God invites us into? Remember the combination at the beginning Paul had. Belief and salvation leads to a new life. So actually, something to notice with Abraham and Sarah, their life became a train wreck. Abraham exploits both Hagar and Sarah, even though it was Sarah's idea. And look at the problem for the kids. When there's issues with the parents, there's always sibling rivalry. Same thing with Adam and Eve. They have unresolved issues, and you have a murder in chapter 4 of the Bible. And so with here, they've created all the problems with the parents. Like Hagar feels like nothing in that home. It's an awful experience for her. And then you have like the envy from Ishmael to the favourite kid, Isaac, and the shame on him. They have a terrible life, really. Abraham messed up their family big time by deciding, I'm taking this matter into my own hands. It spells slavery for them. So there's the two things. The first application is, I forgot it now. What was the first application? Do you guys remember it? I forgot the way I said it, sorry. Say again? Yeah, watch out for the extra justifications. Thank you. Thanks, Roman. The second one, what was the second one? Well, what do you remember? Yeah, where do you take your hunger? And the third one, what would it look like in our church if you were to become a friend like Paul? Verse 19 and 20, just read this. Paul, see a lot of people read this letter, and because you don't have the flowery prayers at the front and all that sort of gear, you think, oh, this is like Paul's big uppercut, he's like angry at everyone. But when you get to chapter 4, he's virtually weeping. Look at verse 19. My dear children, for whom I am in the pains of childbirth until Christ be formed in you, how I wish I could be with you. Listen to the pleading of that guy. It's huge what he's saying. Here's the thing, for Paul, truth is not a weapon. So this is very important. So for Paul, you might have a sword and a scalpel and they're both blades, but you can either cut to win or cut to heal. It's very significant what Paul's doing here. He's taking his doctrine and trying to apply it to change their life. He's trying to bring it in relationship to their hearts. This is probably the most doctrinal section in Galatians, maybe even the high point. And you've got to know Paul doesn't have a split personality. He doesn't have a personality disorder. He's not like in verse 19 going, oh, my dear children, I'm perplexed. I'm just so worried that you would become like Christ. And then, okay, class, page 174, lecture 58 on Hagar and Sarah. Let's go. Get your pens out. He's not doing that. He doesn't transition from counselling to like abstract theology. In fact, his doctrine here is a part of his counselling. So here's the thing. There's a lot of us here, a lot of people actually believe all the doctrine Paul's just taught, but we do not see people changing their life like Paul saw. You can use your doctrine to either maim or heal. So what would it look like Paul, to bring the truth to bear in a friendship, to bring the truth to bear through the mode or the channel of a friendship? What might that look like? So we have a tendency to read the whole Bible like it's all lecture. Verse 19 says, "My dear children, for who I'm in the pains of childbirth, that Christ may be formed in you." Maybe here's the three things for them. One, to be a friend like Paul, you need to have a vision for the greatness of another person. You need to have a vision for who God's making them to be. Because God is forming us to do good works that only we can do, people only that we can help, things only we can accomplish. And so do you have a sense, a vision for the greatness of someone else here? And are you committed to helping them see that vision? The Hebrew word kavod means glory. Are you amazed by the glory of another human being? Which has two parts. One, you're captivated with delight in them, and the other is a weight. There's a gravitas to them. Do you recognize the gravitas in others, or even own your own gravitas to see the vision of who they could become? The second thing, he has actually a vision for Christ in particular being formed in them. This is where we get lost. Because most often we do two things that are different to here. One, we want ourselves to be formed in another person, or we want to be formed through the other person. And it's a bit like gardening. You want yourself to be, it's like you prune everything way too much, or you don't prune a single thing. Both are damaging. And so when it comes to trying to help someone grow in Christ, you're not actually about helping someone have Christ formed in them if you're pruning everywhere. It's more about you. And some of us are so needy for approval that we work really hard and we don't prune ever with people because we want them to say we're so awesome. That's also damaging. But Paul, he says, I'm committed, what? That Christ be formed in you. That's a different thing. That means there are going to be times where he prunes, where he's going to challenge someone. That's what he does in Galatians. But see where it's coming from? It's coming from a heart to see them change for the best, to be the person God created them to be. It's an amazing vision. And by the way, all this metaphorical gender bending in the New Testament, it's good for you, right? In one moment, you're called sons of God. The next breath, you're the brides of Christ. And then you're back to, oh no, you're actually here. You're mothers with the Holy Spirit bringing children into God's family. It's wonderful. Maybe one of the signs that you've been transformed by the gospel is, like Paul, you will be inflexible about one thing and pretty much flexible at everything else. Paul is adamant and inflexible about the gospel. It is God's free gift of grace to whoever will believe. Doesn't matter who it is. He's inflexible about that one. Pretty much flexible about everything else. It's a good, maybe, guide for how you're going with it all. Because if you're always sweating the small stuff, maybe that you're pruning everything. Maybe it's more about you. Because that's all that matters, really, and we can work the rest out. That's really the description of Christian community here. So I hope those three things stick with you today. The first application was watch out for the extra justifications. The second one was where do you take your hunger? And the third one was what would it look like if you were to become a friend like Paul, who has a vision for Christ being formed in other people, and you're willing to go through the pains of childbirth to see it happen. That's huge. I'm going to pray, and we're going to sing again. Father God, we ask you to continue to speak to us as we sing as we have friendship and conversation after the service. We thank you for being with us now and for being among us to see us different, to see us changed, to trust you more. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.